Whew. Feels like we've been in non-stop regional championship mode for Pioneer lately. Not that I'm going to complain about that. But there have been events in Brazil, the United States, China, and Oceania recently, but the culmination of RC overload was in Lille, France this past weekend. Not only was there a resurgence of my GOAT, Andrea Mengucci in the top 8, but a resurgence of sacrifice and food-based decks with Yigra. Lille had quite a few shakeups with the format mainstays, in addition to a couple of new decks that might need to get added to the top tier power rankings. Lille's winning deck in Golgari Food marked the 8th unique archetype to win a regional championship over this rapid fire span of 8 events, making Pioneer look incredibly healthy, diverse, and primed for Wizards to bring it back during the Spotlight series next year. Please. Although we do have a bit of a break before the cream of the crop start prepping for the Pioneer Pro Tour at the start of next year, I'm going to walk through how the metagame wound up looking at Lille at a high level, including how many of each deck were in the room, as well as an overall breakdown of those decks' performance and their popularity. We'll highlight the top 10 winningest decks, regardless of the number of pilots that played them, as well as a look at the top 10 presence decks, which cares about how many pilots played them, and how those top 10 presence decks stacked up against one another in head-to-head matchups to give you the best possible look at the format as a whole for preparation for whatever Pioneer event you're going to be playing. Now, as it always shakes out with this type of analysis, I'm going to give some information on the data we're breaking down and put in some caveats so you can think about this while I'm going through these numbers. I am again using Melee Platform Services and Data. Thank you very much, which has 546 recorded players with, get this, all of them having registered deck lists. Huzzah! It's an analyst dream come true in a magical Christmas land. Unlike my Worlds breakdown earlier this month, I am going to be including all of the matches in the win rate calculations since there were no forced buys in the later rounds like there were at Worlds. That means we'll be including all intentional draws, normal draws, and everything else in the overall win rate calculations. Likewise, the top 8 matters. This isn't just based on Swiss results. Now that the numerical nonsense is out of the way, let's deep dive into the decks that were at Lille this weekend. 50 unique deck archetypes were played, with 44% of them having 5 or more pilots playing them. This jumps up to 52% of the room if you look at the archetypes with 3 or more decks at the tables, and 12% of the pilots were twinsies with someone else in the room, playing the only 2 copies of their archetype at Lille, while 36% of these archetypes were the only ones that got put on a table at the RC. Of these decks, Izzet Phoenix, Rakdos Demons, and Rakdos Prowess topped the metagame breakdown, as expected, with Selesnya Company garnering a lot more support than what we saw in Washington, D.C., where it really broke out into the format. Azorius Control, Lotus Field Combo, and Enigmatic Incarnation continued to be popular amongst Pioneer players, while 4-color Zur peaked with 25 decks in the room, using Zur Eternal Schemer to turn multiple impending overlords from Duskmourn into creatures way ahead of schedule. Jund Sacrifice saw much less play than previous events, but stuck around with similar numbers to the Rakdos Transmogrify deck that did do well in Washington, D.C. The Orzhov version of the Demons deck and the Azorius version of Humans also saw double-digit decks being played, while tournament-winning Rakdos Tree back from DC scaled down in the number of pilots playing it. Acerat combo rose from the dead, tapped for mana, and went back to its hand a lot in Lille, while multiple versions of Greasefang and Creativity decks fought each other for the title of Best Deck in the format of that type. If you're interested in what some of these decks looked like, I posted a thread on my Twitter account the other day linking to some of the deck lists that stood out to me, even if they didn't have the greatest results. That link should be on your screen now, and also available down in the description below. But if you're more interested in how the decks performed overall, we're jumping to that right now. We'll be going through the decks by popularity tier, which, as a refresher, is a metric I've assigned to each archetype based on the number of decks that were in the event overall and how many of that deck were played. It assigns a letter based on how many standard deviations away from the average they are, with all the decks falling below the average labeled as the lowest D tier. Basically, it just goes to show you how popular a deck was at the event. Now, there were only 2 S-tier decks in the room, and it echoes of Pioneer's past with a slight lemon zest twist. Is It Phoenix had slightly below average win rate as the most represented deck in the room, whereas Rakdos Demons had a pretty high win rate for a deck that was as popular as it was in Lille. We'll talk a little bit more about that in just a bit, but I think you can expect to see these 2 titans of Pioneer popping up all over the place for the foreseeable future. The A-tier decks both performed similarly to the S-tier variants, with Selesnya Company putting up some really solid results for having a total of 53 copies in the room. Now, Rakdos Prowess, however, fell in success and in the number of decks being played, which I'm sure a portion of the Pioneer players is happy to hear about. However, both of these decks are still going to be very present at your LGS or other local tournaments, so if you're building a deck or choosing a deck, make sure you keep these in mind because you're going to run into them at least once in the room. Now we're skipping right to C tier, as decks did not have enough copies to qualify for what would have been the B tier of popularity at this event. So Azorius Control had a rough weekend, as did the Lotus Field combo deck. However, both of the enchantment-based decks did close to even in their results, although they were slightly below average, so there's some room for tweaks and improvement there. While the Mardu version of Greasefang, the mono-black version of Demons, and specifically the Rakdos Transmogrify decks had subpar weekends. In the case of Rakdos Transmogrify, it was pretty bad overall. Jund Sacrifice saw less pilots, but great success, putting copies into the top 8 as well as securing a 53.4% win rate against the field on average. Now, there are 38 archetypes that fall into the D tier of popularity, so I'm only going to highlight a few that put up some noteworthy results or are more popular archetypes, while some of them later on will be mentioned in the next section for overperforming. Azorius Humans had 10 copies in the room and a 52.9% win rate on average, proving that the Humans deck still has some legs to stand on in the format and just needs a little bit of help from a secondary color. Similarly, the Gruul version of the Prowess deck put up a better result than the Rakdos cousin version, flipping the script from DC just a few weeks ago. Rakdos Tree, or Cauldron, whatever you want to call it, clocked in at barely under 50% win rate, showing that the DC winning deck is still a contender in the format, although it has less of that surprise shock factor to it now. While a mainstay in Niv to Light had an unfortunate weekend with a 43.2% win rate. So it might be time to lean into enchantments if you're looking at a 4 or more color deck in Pioneer. The Green Devotion decks continue to be played, but continue to be disappointing and suffer results-wise, while the Dimir Ninjas deck broke even, taking the Dimir Tempo mantle from the Rogues decks that have popped up at the other regional championships recently. The Orzhov flavor of Demons, leaning into white alongside Unholy Annex and crew, was just under 50%, while rounding out the D-tier highlights is the cousin of Mardu Greasefang and Abzan Greasefang, which put up a whopping 0.2 percentage points lower of a win rate in the family feud on Fang decks. We've focused a lot on how popular decks were at Lille, but let's change gears a little bit and instead look at how successful some of those decks were, regardless of the number of pilots that were playing them. Taking a page out of Standards book from Worlds recently, a Singleton Boros Burn deck soared to the top of the win rate charts with a 78.6% win rate at Lille. This deck looks very similar to the mono red standard deck, utilizing some prowess creatures, even Hired Claw, and of course Screaming Nemesis, but then takes advantage of the deeper Pioneer card pool in order to not only easily splash a color thanks to the better mana base provided by Shocklands and all the extra duels that you get from Pioneer, but also upgrading some of these cards, such as adding Soulscar Mage and adding the additional angle of attack of Eidolon of the Great Revel to the mix, while backing it up with Standard and Pioneer All-Stars Lightning Helix and Boros Charm in order to really seal the deal on games. Now, a version of the cat combo food deck dropped the red and got rid of Fable of the Mirror Breaker, in addition to having multiple pilots in the room and soaring to a 70% win rate. Now, a lot of those words don't make sense in combination with one another, especially if you've been playing Pioneer over the last couple of weeks or month, but the Golgari food version wound up finding its own version of Bloodtithe Harvester in Vinereap Mentor, and then was able to get rid of the extra red cards such as Mayhem Devil and the aforementioned Fable of the Mirror Breaker, and just go harder on the ability to find Cauldron Familiar and Yigra Eater of All. Scavenger's talent in this version is backed up by Traverse the Uvenwald to find your combo pieces, and the addition of Vraska Golgari Queen as not only a sack outlet but a way to deal with tough slow mana permanents from your opponent is just an added bonus to this food deck. Now, jumping down the win rate column a tiny bit at 59.1% is an oldie but a goodie. Azorius Spirits found 2 pilots in the room having decent success with a list that doesn't look all too different, besides the addition of some enduring cards from Duskmourn that we did wind up seeing at some of the other RCs recently. Enduring Innocence allows a bunch of these low power and toughness creatures to enter the battlefield and cantrip, while Enduring Curiosity takes advantage of the tempo style of play and most of the creatures flying in order to keep that card draw and pressure up on its opponents. Sheltered by Ghost, of course, came in as not only a way to buff your life total with lifelink and make some of those creatures a slightly larger threat, but it removes problematic permanents of all shapes and sizes, which is a big issue that these tempo style decks had previously. Now, even though there's only one copy of this version of Creativity in the room with a 57.1% win rate, I think this is a direction I like these types of lists going. The Jeskai version of the Creativity deck not only still had the powerful package of creatures in order to search for with Indomitable Creativity, being Atraxa and Valgavoth Terror Eater in this circumstance, but it backed up the normal cards like Fable of the Mirror Breaker, Volcanic Spite, Deduce, and everything, with the ability to run No More Lies, Dovin's Veto, The Wandering Emperor, and High Noon. That meant that the deck had a backup control-y style game plan, and the creativity plan wasn't as all-in or as turbo needed as it could be in the Izzet or older versions of the deck, and allowed the deck to play a little bit more of a control and long game style before slamming something big down on the battlefield. Now, another deck with a singleton copy and a 57.1% win rate as well that holds a special place in my heart is the Jund Citadel deck. Now, this is the older style of these sort of sacrifice decks that we have in the current metagame today, utilizing cards like Gilded Goose, Prosperous Innkeeper, Catacomb Sifter, and Woe Strider on top of Bolas's Citadel to flip over as many cards as possible from the top of your deck by paying life instead of mana and keeping that chain going. Cards like Priest of Forgotten Gods and Mayhem Devil still make an appearance in this list to allow Bolas's Citadel to kill almost instantaneously as soon as you're able to activate it and sacrifice 10 non-land permanents, but as you continue to go throughout the game, they take pot shots at your opponent's life total, keep their board small, and let your combo deck play out a little bit more akin to the sack decks that we're used to seeing, while still utilizing cards like Collected Company to flood the battlefield with value. Yet another singleton deck at 57.1% win rate is the long-forgotten Rona Luca combo deck, which could also be looked at as the how many combos can we fit into one deck possibly. Now, this of course is going to be utilizing Rona Herald of Invasion, as well as Tyvar Jubilant Brawler. We have Kinnan Bonder Prodigy, Mox Amber, and Retraction Helix, so that we can kind of go through our deck at will and just kind of keep going and spinning our wheels by creating mana, eventually casting an Atraxa Grand Unifier, or being able to find something in our deck that just winds up giving us a wish granted, like our Fae of Wishes, to find Aetherflux Reservoir from our sideboard and blast our opponent for tons of life, Amalia style. The Luca Coppercourt Outcast part of this also just allows you to sort of creativity into an Atraxa if you need to do that instead of working your way all the way through the combo and doing all the hard work. So putting 2 ways in there to put out a big creature while still having a sideboard plan to blast them for lethal damage makes this combo deck convoluted yet deadly. Speaking of convoluted combo decks, 9 pilots decided to take a different spin on a combo deck into Lille. The Acerak combo deck had a 56.2% win rate, but instead of going through loops with Rona and Kinnan in order to blast somebody with an Aetherflux Reservoir, it wound up using the namesake Acerak the Archlich as well as Gwenna Eyes of Gaia to continue a loop going and going, bouncing your Acerak back to your hand, and creating enough mana to recast it thanks to Relic of Legends in order to continue going through the dungeon and eventually going through so many times that you wound up bathing in the dark pool just enough to drain your opponent's life total. Now, a more standard approach or familiar approach to the creativity deck in Is It Creativity had 3 pilots in the room to Jeskai 1 and a slightly lower win rate at 56.0%, yet still pretty respectable for the tournament across 3 pilots. Now, the big thing about the Is It Creativity list and creativity in general at Lille is the fact that they swap from Atraxa to the big old Valgavussi. Valgavoth Terror Eater. So in order to not only win the game with this giant flying 9/9, but when Is It Phoenix and the Sacrifice or Golgari food decks are running around, it basically shut off your opponent's ability to win. So even if they answered your Valgavoth, you could wind up winning with Shark Typhoons, Fable of the Mirror Breakers, or you just go ahead and creativity for another one. Valgavussi OP. What is probably now the de facto Rakdos mid-range deck in Rakdos Demons not only had the second most decks in the room, but the 9th highest win rate at Lille at 53.7% win rate. When you have that many players and that high of a win rate, that makes me think that this is going to be one of the top decks, if not the top deck in the Pioneer format going forward for the time being. Now, everybody by now is pretty familiar with the Unholy Annex synergy between itself and Demons. Some of the lists were still running Bloodletter of Aclazotz. Most of them were still running Unstoppable Slasher. Some went down the curve to Blade of the Oni to try to turn Unholy Annex on as soon as you cast it, while others stayed a little bit larger, went for Archfiend of the Dross, or maybe even dipped out of Demons into Shieldred the Apocalypse. But whatever way you slice it, card advantage through Fable of the Mirror Breaker and Unholy Annex paired with some number of demons is going to be the way that these Rakdos decks outgrind the rest of the meta. Now, bringing up the rear is the Jund version of the food or sacrifice deck, which also had a decent amount of pilots, although not nearly as many as Rakdos Demons, with 16 pilots combining for a 53.4% win rate across the field. This is the more traditional style of what we've seen Rakdos Sacrifice evolve into, keeping the third color for Mayhem Devil and Bloodtithe Harvester, as well as Fable of the Mirror Breaker, while having the Cauldron Familiar, which is of an Ygra Eater of All and Scavenger's Talent kind of combo in the deck. So you're still able to dig through the rest of your deck, you're able to find your cat combo, but your backup plan in the Jund version is a little bit more of a tried and tested Pioneer staple by copying Bloodtithe Harvesters or making enough Mayhem Devils with copies of Fable of the Mirror Breaker to just dome your opponent for lethal the hard way. Moving away from the most winning decks and into the top 10 presence decks in the room, we're going to look at how those most popular decks did head-to-head against one another in the room at Lille. I don't think it would be a Pioneer tournament if we didn't talk about Is It Phoenix somewhere near the top of the metagame share. Even though Phoenix was the most popular deck in the room at Lille, its win percent was not the greatest at an overall 48.4% win rate, and while it did have some decent matchups across the board, there were other decks that it struggled against due to its current configuration. Now, the Selesnya Company, Rakdos Prowess, Azorius Control, Mardu Greasefang, and Mono Black version of the Demons decks were all favorable matchups at least 50% or higher win rate for the Phoenix deck, but where it really struggled was against the staying power of the Rakdos version of Demons, thanks to Unholy Annex and Fable of the Mirror Breaker, as well as continuing to struggle against decks like Enigmatic Incarnation, which then of course meant the 4-color Zur deck, which is a beatdown version of that, was able to take a high win rate against the Phoenix deck, and then the Lotus Field combo deck, which is again a historic tough matchup for Phoenix, continued to beat up upon the Birds. Now, just beforehand, we talked about how Rakdos Demons had the 9th highest win rate at the entire tournament, so let's take a look at how it performed against the top 10 presence decks in the room, where it had pretty solid matchups against basically everything in the room that wasn't running more enchantments that it could deal with. The 4-color Zur and Enigmatic Incarnation deck, while being mostly enchantment based, were going to be hard for the Rakdos version of this deck to beat, considering Rakdos midrange historically has poor performances against decks that are based on the enchantment card type. But across the board against everything else popular in the room, 50% or higher win rates just goes to show how powerful this configuration of Rakdos really is. Now, the Selesnya Company deck was a breakout at the RC in DC, but it took a slight backseat in Lille, and even though it went up the charts in popularity, it did go slightly down in win rate at 52.4%, which is still not bad overall and way above average. Now, the deck did struggle against some of the more popular decks in the room, such as Is It Phoenix and Rakdos Demons, where it had a sub 50% win rate, but still above 40% and pretty close to even against Phoenix overall. But it did wind up also struggling against the Enigmatic Incarnation deck, as Temporary Lockdown is very powerful against the 2-mana spells that it's trying to collect a company into, and the Enigmatic deck did eventually have the ability to go over the top when it wasn't being taxed on casting spells, because they were just searching for them instead. Against the rest of the field, however, the Selesnya Company deck proved just to be too taxing and toiling across the board, so the green-white deck here might be a mainstay of Pioneer in the near future. Alright, so much to the merriment of maybe a lot of Pioneer pilots, the Rakdos Prowess deck had a tough weekend in Lille. While it had 49 decks in the room and was still an A-tier popularity deck, it only had a 47.9% average win rate across the board. When it comes to the most popular matchups in the room, it struggled against the top 3 decks, losing out against Is It Phoenix, Rakdos Demons, and Selesnya Company, specifically the 2nd and 3rd decks on that top list there, being 32.6 and 33.3% win rate respectively, so 1 in 3 matches it wound up coming away with victoriously. Yikes. Now, it did still have the staying power, or the speed, I should actually say, to beat out some of these slower decks, like the Lotus Field combo deck, and get under some of the Azorius Control matchups, while punishing Enigmatic Incarnation for taking its time. But the other decks that were able to keep up with it in speed, or just being able to 1-for-1 remove their threats, like Mardu Greasefang and Mono Black Demons, were a bit of a thorn in its side at under 50% win rate. Alright, so Control has had a roller coaster of the last month or so, winning the RC in Brazil, doing okay in DC, and now having the lowest win rate out of the top 10 presence decks in the room at Lille. 41.1% win rate is very low for a top presence deck, and as you can see, as this matchup spread against those top 10 decks in the room shows, it struggled to find victories against not only the 4 most popular decks in the room, but also some towards the lower end, as more Lotus Field combo pilots entered the fray at Lille, and therefore brought another bad matchup for the Control deck. Now, it did do well against the new rising crop of enchantment-based synergies in 4-color Zur and Enigmatic Incarnation, as well as continue to keep down the mono black version of Demons that didn't have the same staying power with Fable the Mirror Breaker and the other cards that Rakdos gave, and was still able to shut down some creature-based combo decks like Mardu Greasefang. All right, it's time to talk about a deck that I love to watch at this RC. The 4-color Xur deck was not an incarnation deck, and instead used Xur to animate the overlords and just start swinging for some low impending costs. 48.1% win rate is below average for a new to the metagame deck. However, this deck did have some fun lines of play if you go back and watch it. Specifically, this deck attacked the top half of the presence decks in the room, or top presence decks in the room, preying upon Izzet Phoenix and Rakdos Demons, as they are unable to deal with the enchantment creature type that easily, nor are they quick enough to deal with an overlord that's a 5/5 swinging as soon as turn 3 or 4. Now, it was not fast enough or configured correctly to deal with some of the other decks in the room, specifically Azorius Control and the Lotus Field combo decks, so it did lose a lot of matches there, and it looks like overall may struggle against some of the other combo decks like Mardu Greasefang as well, so we might still be looking for the best removal or interaction package for the Xur deck. Now, it seems like it's been a little while since I talked about the Lotus Field combo deck, and it might stay that way after its performance in Lille. Now, while it was one of the top 10 presence decks in the room, a 42.1% overall win rate is nothing to be super proud about. Now, while it did attack Izzet Phoenix at the top of the metagame very well, it struggled against a bunch of the Black X mid-range decks, specifically the Rakdos Demons deck and the mono-black version of the Demons deck, just having too much interaction for the combo shell to deal with. The Selesnya Company deck, coming out in larger numbers, also taxed all of its spells and made the deck slow down far too much, and it was still just not fast enough to deal with the prowess power of the Rakdos aggro list. Enigmatic Incarnation might not be the only enchantment deck on the block, but it was the one that was slightly more successful this weekend at a 49% win rate, even across all of its matchups. While looking at the top 10 presence decks, we knew that it was going to do well against the Izzet and Rakdos Demons deck, but also put up a decent showing against the Selesnya Company deck. Like, as I mentioned before, it's able to search its library and just put things into play if you land Incarnation, so you don't need to always be casting spells and holding them in your hand, so the taxing effects of the Company deck don't really hurt you as much as it may some of these other matchups. Of course, anything that is a Black X mid-range based deck is going to struggle against the enchantments from Enigmatic Incarnation. However, the other decks in the room that were decent to deal with it, whether it be in speed or just a plan A of their own, like Lotus Field combo and Rakdos Prowess, were still able to beat up on the classic version of the enchantment-based multicolored deck. Mardu flavor of Greasefang. It's been a long time since I've seen you at the top tables of the Pioneer metagame. You only rocked a 47.8% win rate overall, but you brought some cool tools to the table in fear of missing out an Overlord of the Balemerc to continue with your rat pilots things out of its graveyard strategy. Unfortunately, it wasn't enough to deal with the most played decks in the room, with losing win rates against Izzet Phoenix, which is no surprise as that does well into the Abzan version as well, but also against Rakdos Demons and Selesnya Company. So the parts of the metagame that you were able to target, like the Rakdos Prowess deck, even the 4-color Xur deck, and the mono-black version of the Demons deck, it just was not enough of those decks in the room for the Mardu version of Greasefang to really take the reins and pilot itself to the top of the metagame. But if the things do shift around, and with red in the deck now instead of green, you do have a couple of other sideboard options to play with, I could see Mardu Greasefang sprouting some wings and slowly climbing up against some of these decks. Now, the mono-black version of the Demons deck, which was the kind of OG style, did rock a lower win rate than its Rakdos brethren at 48.6% overall, but it did have its spots against some of the top decks. Downside was that it wasn't against Phoenix or Rakdos Demons in and of themselves. Having a 33.3% win rate against the top 2 decks played in the room is not the greatest place to be, but it did continue to beat up on decks that were smaller, like Rakdos Prowess, where you were able to just kind of 1-for-1 remove and eventually get larger and bigger than your opponents, and was surprisingly good against the 4-color Xur deck while struggling against Enigmatic Incarnation as expected. Of course, being able to play mono mono black means that you can run a lot of hand disruption, and that is going to make your combo-based matchups a lot better, like against Lotus Field combo. However, it did wind up struggling against Mardu Greasefang, so it might not just have had the right combination of removal spells, or just not enough graveyard hate to deal with a graveyard-based combo deck that was as fast as Greasefang. Now, although that was a lot to unpack, what Lille really showed us was how healthy and diverse a format Pioneer has become after the recent shakeups with printings of new sets, some bans way back in August, and just the amount of preparation that people had for a tournament that actually matters. So even though we're not going to see pro play until the beginning of next year, which is technically the end of the 2024 season, if that's confusing at all for anybody else, I know it is. The beginning of 2025 is going to be Pro Tour for Pioneer, but will be the last pro level event for the format that we are going to see for the foreseeable future, at least a year out. So while I do hope that some of the Magic Spotlight series pick up Pioneer as a format to showcase, or that the fact that Pioneer Masters is coming out to Arena very soon and will nigh complete the format online for some sort of online tournaments, I know that if you're a paper first player such as myself, the Pioneer events are going to be kept a little bit more local and small for the foreseeable future. However, I do have hopes with the RCs and the way that they shook out now, as well as a looming Pro Tour, that some of the larger tournament organizers like Star City Games will wind up having Pioneer side events, for at least for some high stakes. And like I said, the MSS could potentially still pick up Pioneer as a competitive format in the near future. So Pioneer looks really, really good. There's a lot of different decks out there and things that I'm really excited to try out. But I want to hear what you want to try out. There were a ton of awesome decks at Lille. There were a ton of high performance decks there. And of course, some mainstay staples of the format putting up mixed results. So what are you excited about in Pioneer? What decks at Lille are you going to be trying out in your local Pioneer metagame? And what do you think are going to be the decks to beat when it comes to the Pro Tour, even though we still have Aether Drift up and coming to release in that time period? You can let me know in the comments below, and while you're down there, thumbs up the video to let everybody know that you are a Pioneer enjoyer and that everybody else should be tuning into the format as well. Now, if you have liked my content like this, you can consider joining my members, which I want to give a chance to shout out right here. You can click the join button down below the video or on my home YouTube page to take benefit of all of the great member things, such as being able to answer member only polls, getting my videos out before everybody else gets a chance to see them, other members only content that gets posted on the community feed, as well as getting access to the Discord channel where you can bug me about all of your different format brews and potentially even get your own deck tech done on my channel. Of course, you can always tap that subscribe button to stay up to date on the latest deck techs, metagame analysis, and overall Magic content from me. Keep slinging spells, Pioneer pilots.